So let's jump into today's topic. It's going to be a fun one. You probably think wireless. Oh, that's the boxes on the wall with the lights. And when I get close enough to one, my phone tells me that I can get on the internet. But that's not what that is anymore. We've slowly kind of migrated the standard away from just a radio in a box with an Ethernet cable to miniature computers running all kinds of software services. Maybe it's on the box, maybe it's in the cloud somewhere. How does this whole security thing work? Where are the challenges? Because they're not access points anymore. It's edge connectivity. When's the last time you plugged an Ethernet cable into your personal device? Does your personal device even have an Ethernet port? So I think I want to open this kind of discussion up because one of the things that we've seen from a lot of companies that have presented at Mobility Field Day for the last year or two is this idea of being focused in the cloud, which kind of feels weird to me because shouldn't all the traffic like exist locally? It's like go to the access point and then figure out where to go. Why should I be sending stuff to the cloud? Like that sounds like controller stuff, right? We don't do controllers anymore.
So as I teach stuff as well, and one of the things that I train is Juniper Mist, and I think there's a difference in what do we want to see go to the cloud and what not. And so data, of course, you don't want to see that go to the cloud, but even before Juniper Mist started doing things cloud first, I think the very first Wi-Fi company that did it was Aerohive back in the day, thinking of, okay, we want to do cloud first. And what they immediately did is say, okay, well, we want to make that cloud solution a management and control function. There's no actual data going into the cloud. And so I think there's already a differentiation there into, okay, can stuff be in the cloud or can stuff be in the cloud?
But I think it's less about can stuff be in the cloud versus can stuff be in the cloud. I think it's is it appropriate for a given service to be in the cloud? We've seen numerous vendors talk about putting Radius and NAC into the cloud, and when you look at that from a traditional network experience perspective, those are resources we've always kept super close to the user. Not because that's what's the most convenient, but there are practical reasons why those services are close to the user, and that's largely latency driven reasons. So when you start talking about moving those critical control plane functions across the other side of a circuit that may impose some significant latency, we battle all day long with fighting with roaming problems and latency driven or latency laden networks. We're talking about adding yet another component of latency into a critical piece of our network that I think is just it's probably just not appropriate, I think, for most people, for the overwhelming majority of people, especially critical voice services where you need high-speed roaming and those sort of things.
Yeah, so I think there are two pieces, a couple of things I kind of want to say on that. Great point, but like, one, if an organization that is very cloud-centric and they do have the capability of having circuits, multiple circuits possibly that are, that are good dedicated circuits, low latency, and they have some kind of SLAs and all that from ISPs, I mean, that can obviously help with that situation, one. And then secondly, possibly, I mean, there's a lot of cloud vendors, cloud NAC vendors out there, right? I mean, there's multiple different vendors. So if there's a possibility to also bring like a part of that service, like where like there's a failover. So if there's latency and it can detect latency and can fail over to a local resource where it's being cached or something like that. So I think that will probably help too. So it can eliminate that issue.
Well, let's take a step back because this is kind of one of those things of, at Tech Field Day, we talked to a lot of companies who do a lot of different things in a lot of different areas. And man, for the last 3-4 years, it's been cloud, cloud, cloud. And it's actually really odd for people to kind of step back and go, why? What is the value of putting this stuff in a cloud, whether it's controlled plane traffic or authentication traffic or what have you? Why would I want to do that instead of keeping it local or keeping it somewhere that's not Amazon or Oracle or AWS or wherever, or Azure?
You shouldn't. I agree.
The contrarian speak.
Well, I think with every solution that there is a sliding scale and there's pros and cons to each approach. If you wanted to consolidate every function of your access point into the cloud, you're managing it in one spot, you're not worrying about the hardware, the vendor's taking care of the updates, the vendor's taking care of I would say the security of that instance, not necessarily your network security. And the trade-off is you're getting the higher latency. You're at the whim of whatever they've done, wherever they've deployed it. If there's an outage there, you might have an outage for whatever you're controlling there. But that might be the trade-off that business wants to make based on their business use cases. So if we want to talk about like radius in the cloud, you're right. If you're roaming and can't do .11r, and can't do .11r, your roam times are going to suffer. If you're doing VoIP, that's not the solution for you, but it might be fine and a trade-off that another business is willing to make.
I don't disagree, but what we heard, I think what we've heard so far, and I think what I've heard at every single Tech Field Day session is that nuance about why it actually depends is completely lost in the positioning of the particular solution. Yes, we all sort of intrinsically understand that, you know, adding latency into an authentication conversation is bad. But we didn't hear that from the vendors. They're just out selling, hey, cloud, put NAC in the cloud. And it's not just the one we heard today, right? I've heard it from numerous vendors. And you're right, the answer is as always, it depends, right? What are you giving up in order to give this? But that the nuance of that conversation is just gone nowadays. People don't want to hear, yeah, but you're going to have to give something up. They want it all. They want it all in the cloud. And when it breaks, they're stuck holding the bag. Well, because somebody sold them a bunch of.
And I think it depends on, again, what your environment is like. If your NAC is based around a bunch of policy that is already in the cloud, if you're, for example, an Azure AD shop,
sure,
and with Intune on every laptop, well, your local Radius server is still going to need to talk to cloud stuff because it's going to need to check with Azure AD to find out, you know, if you're doing some sort of like, oh, only certain users in a certain group get to do wireless. Only, you know, your posture, we have to check that against, you know, when's the last time you checked into the cloud Intune, all that kind of stuff. So there could be some cases where it's like all the things that are bad about the cloud are already there. So the amount of badness that you're adding by moving the authentication conversation up into the cloud, maybe that would actually improve because now all of those posture checks and everything is happening within the vendor's cloud. And if they're, you know, depending on what the cloud to cloud latency is, I mean, I don't even know this.
I agree with you 100%, but I think all of those solutions that you mentioned have an on-premises function or have an on-premises component specifically to alleviate the latency concerns of the cloud. The solutions we're hearing about today don't have a caching component on site. And so, yeah, you might have Azure running in the cloud, but are you not taking that Azure data and caching it to something that's local on premises so that you don't have to go to the cloud in order to do everything every single time? Right? There's a reason those boxes exist, and that's what we're seeing from the enterprise networking manufacturers. They simply don't care.
But isn't it just the same thing that where we as professionals need to manage customer expectations? It's the same as 9.6 gigabit for AX. So it's up to us.
Absolutely.
So I think one thing I'll point out, so Sam, I'm mostly on your side where I think these are the sorts of things that should be kept closer to the user. But as I think through it, we do tons of NAC deployments for customers and networks of all sizes. And what I found is at the larger end, we're deploying it largely into their cloud, whatever that might be. It might be a private cloud, right? But it's still their cloud. We're centralizing those services inside of their own distributed networks. So as much as we push on them to say, let's put these services closer to the users, they're pushing back and saying, well, no, how about we put them in these regional data centers?
But it's their regional data centers that
they
have control over. They're not fighting the DIA circuit being routed all over the
Absolutely true, but
country, right?
That's a small leap from them saying that to them saying, well, why don't we just run it at AWS instead? Yeah. And they do that. And it's, so as much as I like, and we push very hard to try to keep those services close to the users, we're getting a lot of pushback on it. So I think from the perspective of, is it what customers are asking for? Probably.
No doubt.
Yeah. I think what make it interesting to go into the cloud, especially where it's totally managed, is whoever here ever did the ICE upgrade from a major version to another major version know the pain of it. And if it's in the cloud, hey, you know, it's it's magical. The provider will take care of it.
Well,
and most of the shop,
not necessarily, because you can put ice in the cloud and it doesn't take care of
and to be
versioning
fair,
upgrades, right? That's a function of the
that's a
product.
problem that Cisco
Yeah.
could choose to solve if they wanted to. They could make these up. They could refactor it and be like, okay, ICE 4, and now it's a microservices architecture, and now the upgrades are going to be painless. But then again, they promised that with DNAC. So
Well, let me throw this out here because we've talked a lot about cloud, right? And the opposite of cloud is on-prem. If you want to think about it in, kind of, black and white terms. What prem? Because I don't know about the rest of you, but the definition of what on-premises means right now is radically different for an organization that requires all of their employees to be in the office 5 days a week versus an organization that requires their employees to be in the office 2 days a week versus an organization where I go to the office maybe once every 6 months. And I might be working out of a Starbucks one day.
On-premises is largely defined by a campus, a contiguous campus area, right? It's the latency problems of putting NAC or Radius in the cloud. You're not going to see at home because you're not going to take that voice call from your bed where you're working and expect to wander around your house. You will at a large campus, right? The mobility concerns of a large area are what's problematic here. It's not that, hey, I've got some work from home stuff, therefore I've got a bunch of on-premises facilities that I need to have a bunch of on-premises caching servers for. No. One AP at one person's house, absolutely. NAC, Radius in the cloud, go for it. Because you're right, once you've authed, you're done.
And I think that's a key component is it's not necessarily suited to everyone. And there's some environments where you wouldn't want to have, your NAC in the cloud, but there's plenty where you would. There's plenty of distributed organizations that are made up of, you think about retail, made up of lots and lots of retail stores. Very few of them have their own Radius center. It's in some sort of data center somewhere, and they have that latency anyway. And actually moving it to the cloud might make the latency less than going back to the organization's local data center. So I think you've got to look at the application and what you're trying to achieve and then choose what's appropriate.
As always.
Well, it's kind of funny that we talked about services and things like that, like Radius. Technically, if you think about it, Radius was originally a cloud service. We just didn't call it a cloud at the time because it was remote authentication dial-in user service. You had to connect to another system somewhere else to get your Radius profile. And then even if you think about, I can remember talking to companies about, the BYOD surge, right? Remember that? You know what BYOD was? I'm going to show up with my laptop and be able to use services in an organization, in an enterprise, because I can get a software load on my laptop now, right? Well, now that has kind of exploded because as technology has marched on, there was no way that we could do secure web gateway or, CASB, cloud access security brokering 6 years ago. That idea did not exist. We were just getting into SD-WAN, which begat SASE, which begat SSE. And, for those who out there are fans of Security Field Day, all of those acronyms make total sense to you because you're dealing with this right now. We are living in a world where SD-WAN can be a client running on a laptop that provides a connection to services in the cloud to authenticate proxies and things like that. I can remember in my former life as a VAR having to configure web filters at schools for COPA. And now my web filter can live on my kid's laptop because every web search has to hit a proxy in the cloud. That's not something I would have considered even being possible 15 years ago, but yet technology is where we are now. So could it be that the cloud has given us the capability to race ahead and do these things, but we're being held back by the protocols that we know and love that we've relied on for all of these years?
No, because my concerns aren't protocol driven at all. My concerns are latency driven. Latency doesn't matter when you're dealing with a 2400 baud modem, right? It's just part of the handshake that you're dialing into. But when you are roaming on a voice call and you pick up, 300 milliseconds for that voice call, that becomes a dramatically different story.
But you can also run into latency, like technically, even if you have on-prem, right? Like Radius server. I mean, I've run into it where.
But that doesn't mean you should just punt it to the cloud and do it on purpose.
but that's not going to happen all the time, right? I mean, yeah, it can happen. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. It will definitely happen. I mean, it's inevitable, right? But I mean, it can happen locally because I don't know, some VM got some issues with resources, right? And that affected the DHCP, DNS, and Radius. because they're all on the same VM for some reason. Right? I mean, those kind of situations. So, I mean, it can definitely happen. It'll just depend on the scenario, I guess.
I think
yeah, this
I was going to say, I think also the internet doesn't necessarily equal latency.
No, true.
It can do.
Can.
But if you an organization that's relying on putting some of these key services in the cloud, I would hope that you are purposely making sure you've got a low latency, redundant internet handoff.
You'd think, but
Hopefully, but not everywhere in the world is that easy to do, and not everywhere in this country is it easy to do.
And therefore, don't go for that solution.
I think you're all having the wrong conversation, just to be incredibly controversial here. One of the things we heard today in the thing was Radius started to be called a microservice, right? When we move all of these functions that are, you started with the controller, all of these functions that we have in the network, and consider them to be microservices, right? Then what happens is then where is the best place to run that microservice? And for some people or some applications, it might be better moved onto the edge, and some of it central. So the concept of a cloud, you need to take it away and just think of yourself as having lots of functions, capabilities in the network, and then a vision of the future where you can run those based on what the requirement is. So it's not a matter of saying it, because of latency, it has to be on the edge. In some environments or for some applications or for some users, it needs to be located on the edge. And for others, it can be pulled back centrally. And so it's a different conversation, right? It's not hardware, it's not appliances, it's not things, it's software, right?
Except we're not talking about services that are portable. I've not heard anybody advocate putting DHCP in the cloud, even though that's a standalone service that could run in the cloud just fine. Why wouldn't you put it up there? Because it's dumb. It's a control. It's not. Would you call it a control plane function? It's a critical network service that belongs close to the user, right? Why wouldn't you put DHCP in the cloud? Everybody in this room could do it. Nobody in this room has. Why not?
Well, because the manufacturers of the products have made it very easy for us to deploy it at the edge. It could be on the firewall if we want. It could be at the core if we want. It could be on Windows servers. It could be on Linux servers.
Proxy at the edge is also easy to do, as they've shown, right? You hit the button.
But I think Avril made a really good point. She used a word that's really important, conversation. Mm-hmm. Isn't that what this ultimately comes down to, is the discussion with the customer and understanding the customer's network, the customer's needs, helping them understand what architecture makes the most sense for them. If they have 80% of their resources that they're accessing running locally, well, they're probably not going to put their Radius services in the cloud. If you flip that, though, and it's 80% are in the cloud and 20% local, well, maybe, because now it's less impactful.
I don't disagree. I feel like, though, we should be asking ourselves, just because we can put it in the cloud, does that mean we should put it in the cloud? Especially since in the solutions that we've been talking about, there is no option for resiliency or redundancy.
So,
right?
Yeah, right. And
that's just a...
Two major vendors, right? For example, just recently announced a solution, right? That I think kind of like how, back to what Tom was saying, right? It's just got announced, but I can see the potential where it possibly might evolve into something where there's like some kind of resilient option to it, right? Eventually, 2 years from now, a year from now, 6 months from now.
I just don't like the way you make it sound so black and white. Should it be, shouldn't it? Right? What I'm trying to say is, depending on the requirements, depending on the service, depending on whatever that circumstance is, you make that decision, and potentially dynamically, down the road. It shouldn't be one way or the other. It's dynamic based on what's happening in the network.
And that's what, so far we've seen two vendors come out with platforms that are doing this. And I'll be honest, what I would love to see is an option where your control plane and policy is all defined in the cloud. And then you have some sort of, I mean, you could probably do this on like if you were hardcore and you were going to build this all off of free Radius because you have no life, you could in theory run all of these services NFV'd on a NUC. In the office, right? Radius is not going to consume a lot of horsepower. The tiniest little box, as long as it can connect to the cloud, download the certificates it needs to know, or download the policies it needs to do, it could keep on doing that. It can be like, okay, I'll let the internet flake out if it has to for 12 hours. And then you can go, listen, we can terminate this in the cloud if you want to. If you've got issues with that, if you've got concerns with that, Here's a little box you can buy. You just plug it in, magic happens. It does all that. And then that way, that's how you would give the customer the choice. But right now, the reason why we're debating should you or shouldn't you is because we only have the option of 100% cloud
Yep.
Yes.
or
Yeah.
100%.
And that's what we've got to
Okay.
change, because it has to be able to have the flexibility to dynamically move it to the edge. And the thing that would worry me more than radius and authentication would be the scheduling of our RF resources, which is where we're stuck with Wi-Fi 6, right? Is the scheduling of RF. And that normally needs to be right at the edge, right? I'd be hesitant to centralize that in the cloud, right?
Yet we're talking about all these wouldn't it be greats, right? But here it is 2023 and we have two major network vendors that brought competing products to the market with no resiliency or redundancy options. How is that okay in this year?
Are there really no resiliency and redundancy?
He literally said there is no
Well,
way
there's
to
no
do.
failover in the event of that local site
Yeah,
internet going
that's
down.
what I mean.
But they're inherently resilient and redundant because they are geo-aware in the cloud.
Meaning there's no service level redundancy.
There's no
in the event of an
local
internet
service
outage.
redundancy.
Yeah.
But if you're a massively distributed organization, one building might go down, one campus might go down, but your other 10 stay up and running because it's inherently.
Well, but their approach to geo-awareness then makes me wonder, and the questions that I would encourage people to ask if they look at these: are you multi-cloud, or is critical enough of an AWS or Azure outage going to take you down? Because what happens when AWS goes down? Literally, the help desk lights up with the internet is down, because all these services that your users rely on that live in AWS, to them are the internet. And when they're not reachable, they're like, oh, your network must be broken, because AWS would never go down or Azure would never go down. But that happens.
But this goes back to what are the business requirements? Not all products and not all architectures are for all clients. So you have to make that decision on those trade-offs and what you want to do.
I want to bring up something that Avril said, because I think that I found a spanner to throw into this works, and we talked about it today. If the value of having a centralized service is that you have visibility over everything and you can create centralized policy to define business rules, and then you can push that policy to the edge through the use of microservices in a centralized location, who got there first? Because I'm talking about zero trust network architecture. The buzzword that everybody's been using for the last couple of years, because now I have an always-on connectivity to a microservice at the edge that looks at a centralized database somewhere in the cloud that allows me to dictate what my users are capable of accessing. We're effectively fighting the chatty nature of Ethernet, or Wi-Fi as the case may be, by selectively choosing to allow or disallow our users to see things. That doesn't work without cloud services, because what happens if my system requires a rolling authentication in order to be able to access, I don't know, SharePoint resources? Well, if my connectivity goes down, obviously I'm not going to be able to get to SharePoint. But building the services in correctly, assuming an always on, assuming a redundant connection. My house doesn't have redundant connections. Nobody's, well, okay. Stephen Foskett, CEO of Tech Building and Gestalt IT, does have redundant connections. But when you think about it, we're architecting toward that. And I know that, Carrie's going to be, the voice of the customer over here and say, you need to have a conversation with your customer and you need to tell them what they need. And somebody's going to stand here and go, you need ZTNA for what? Everything, because it's awesome. It's Chrome. It is everything you ever wanted on that car with the, the heated seats and everything like that. Do I need heated seats? You live in Florida, it's fine. It might get cold one day.
Well, and that all depends, again, on, it's not going to be the same answer for everybody.
Mhm.
If you are, even here in the middle of Silicon Valley, if you're a software company, then you are ideally set up I'm going to bring in the cheapest, Comcast or whatever, and throw up some APs. And if the RF is not a good one, I'm not even going to I might have a PSK on it, and you're all going to run ZTNA, and it's just going to be fine. But if you're a company that, for example, builds things and has labs and has stuff and where not everything can be a software agent, then you're gonna go, oh, I need to have a wire. I really have to care about my wired network. I'm never gonna go to all wireless. Guys have hardware at their desks. And so you're gonna need a more secure wired network. The Beyond Corp model, the Starbucks model that a lot of CIOs dream of, doesn't always mesh with what the business needs. If your business can handle it, great. If it doesn't work for your business, then you're going to need something else.
With the on-prem, another thing to keep in mind, even like if it's on-prem, let's say you have 2 data centers and you have a radius server in one and a radius server 2, like, and there's the resilient connection and redundancy and all that good stuff. But then you have sites that are VSAT or LTE and all that. I mean, you'll still run into the same exact issue, even though you have it on-prem. You're still going to run into the latency issues, even with that, right?
Which is why on those solutions you would put a caching server on site,
Yeah.
right? And so
Right.
that's the point, is that you have that flexibility for my
Mhm.
Usenet networks, right?
I just want to bring an interesting point up on Twitter from Mark, actually saying that putting Redis in the cloud is something that's kind of EduRoam has been kind of doing for years. And that is serving Redis in big campus environments.
Of course,
Universities.
absolutely. And I don't know of anybody who uses EduRoam for their voice over IP over Wi-Fi handsets. Right? That's not where latency is a problem. Where latency is a problem is when you're doing .1x authentication and roaming, for example, on a voice call.
They're not doing it necessarily for that, but they are doing it for their Zoom calls and Teams meetings and things.
No, I disagree. Most people aren't walking around with their laptop
there
like
are-
this
there are
going
plenty of-
around schools, right?
Fair, but there are plenty of universities that it still surprises me that's the only SSID they deploy. They don't have their own. They just deploy EduRoam, and they run everything on that.
And how many of those? What it does everything include your WebEx phone, your SpectraLink phone, your right? I realize that's a certain application, but there's a lot of people who do.
There's a lot of those. If you're talking about those voice specific handsets, and you actually see it deployed, how many are doing 802.1x on them anyway?
I have never. I'll admit I've never
Most are
joined
doing PSA.
EduRoam and made a voice call and tried to walk down the road. Yeah, I've never done that.
No, but what I'm saying is a lot of these voice-specific applications, they're actually not putting 802.1x on the phones for that reason anyway.
Yeah,
Probably
right.
locally, they're doing
Agreed.
PSK.
Yes, because it's dumb. Yeah.
So they're doing PSK, so it's not an issue.
Of course,
Until
there are technical solutions for all of these, because we do it in cellular today, right? You don't drop a call when you're roaming. So there are solutions. Just because we don't have them in the Wi-Fi networks doesn't mean that we still can't move in that direction.
I also think we do have them in the wireless industry. So that the other thing that we've got is there's been lots of efforts for fast roaming on wireless. And, 802.11r, K, there's some stuff with fills that have come up, which is really good, which is coming. And I think yes, not all clients support it, but voice clients are going to support it, the dedicated voice clients that you want, because they want to support it for that reason.
Yep.
So
If I was building a network today and I knew that all of my clients were going to be manufactured this year, it would be an entirely different conversation than if I had to build a network to support come one, come all. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. The problem is legacy. Absolutely.
So would you consider it a critical voice call that's roaming if their device doesn't support 11R? Is it really critical if they're not updating the device?
If it's the CEO and they've got their old busted iPhone from 10 years ago, yeah, it's still critical.
No CEO owns a 10-year-old iPhone.
Oh, I don't know about that. I've seen some. Anyway,
CEOs out there, I want to see your tweets, because I promise you, anyone running less than an iPhone 12 is probably the CEO of a startup with no funding. No, but these are the challenges that we face in IT, right? Because I am notorious for telling people there are no more greenfields. They no longer exist. They are a myth, just like the Tooth Fairy and Bigfoot. Because I promise you, anywhere you go, you're going to be dealing with legacy technical debt and legacy technical debt protocols that we've had to deal with for years. And yeah, I remember when the Facebook engineers were trying to develop a new routing protocol for their millimeter wave routing, and they're like, why can't the hello packets be a megabyte? You guys are just old and silly because you think hello packets need to be like one packet. And we can make them as big as we want. And the old timers in the back are like, yeah, I remember when ISDN was fast. Like when we are carrying forward this knowledge that we have of all these things, Sam, the champion of low latency over here, is like, yeah, I've been there, man. I can remember when we had to communicate all of these things. But yet most people live in a world where all of our video games have to be directly connected to the internet at all times, because that's a thing you can do. And so we are building solutions that assume that my microservices will always have a connection to the cloud somewhere, because why wouldn't you? Everything's online all the time, and yet it's not. So can we fix this problem by shifting our mindset away from this idea that we're always going to be hyper-connected, that we need to build into these systems the ability to do failover, because we can't always assume that everything is going to work perfectly every time. See a lot of nodding heads.
Yeah, you're basically saying we're old.
Yeah. Yeah, if you can remember working on 802.11 before it had letters, you're old.
Token ring?
Thank you.
Hey, I worked on a live token ring network. Thank you very much. I have a pile of tokens at my desk. Well, I think we kind of beat this topic to death, but as you can see, there's a lot of opinions. There's a lot of perspectives on things, and that's one of the values that we bring here at Field Day. It's not just 12 nodding heads saying, yes, I think this is a good idea. Sometimes there's some contrarianism to it. Sometimes there's, well, did you think about that? Or in my world, this is a little bit different. And your world looks different than all of these. And we hope that you found some value in this Delegate Roundtable. And if you would like to participate in a Delegate Roundtable in the future as a delegate at one of our variety of Field Day events, whether it be mobility, networking, security, cloud, edge, or storage, please make sure you head over to techfieldday.com, fill out the link to become a delegate. If you are a company that would be interested in getting in front of these delegates to talk about the solutions that you have to the problems that they bring up, right next to that is a form for sponsors. And if you want to fill that out, we'll happily give you a call and discuss what is involved in being a part of the great Tech Field Day family.